Blog Talk Radio.
Talk about Orwell's view of language, which you also mentioned. Talk about quite a bit about it in the book. What was his contribution? Why does Orwell still matter when we think about language?
Well, Orwell thought that a lot of the work of illegitimate power is done for it by slave volunteers who all they need to do is to use what the French call the langue du bois, the wooden tongue, the tongue that has removed all meaning from language. In other words, that you would describe, say, the forced confiscation and dispossession of agricultural workers as collectivization. Half the job is done if the government can get it called that. They're halfway there. Euphemism was the thing that he was best noticing. So a euphemism I would define as the finding of a nice word for a nasty thing. So, there are so many. I suppose the most famous one now, so famous that no one ever tries it, would be collateral damage for civilian casualties. No one would have, I think, no one would be able to say that with a straight face anymore. Even to say, use the word purge, which we now, of course, think of as a hateful word. We didn't at the time. Purge is a cleansing.
Yeah, it sounds good.
For the mass murder by show trial and disappearance and secret execution of your political opponents, say. Appeasement, remember, at the time, was the word that the Tories themselves used. Appeasement means the peaceful composition of differences, the slaking of certain... It's an agreeable word.
Right.
So
it's only through history that it's become.
Yes, as the word collaboration doesn't ever have again quite the same ring as it once did. So that's of course the revenge of history on euphemism. That the euphemisms themselves become, as we would now if I was to describe you as ethically challenged.
Yeah.
You would know that there was a deadly sting to that because it was once a word that was used to soften the description of something disagreeable, such as disability or crippledom, to give it its right. So Orwell was dead set against all that, and he gave tremendous examples in his criticism, his essayistic literary criticism of the way in which propaganda imports itself into the language and putting people on their guard against it. And he taught not just his own generation but succeeding ones the importance of that.
Powerful words there from Christopher Hitchens, one of the great public intellectuals that we have these days, speaking there on Orwell and language particularly. If you want to hear the entire interview, it's called Hitchens on Orwell, and it's actually for free available on iTunes. So, welcome to the August 24th, 2011 ZM Global Radio Show. My name is Ben, continuing the rotation that various members have in taking some time to speak to the movement and to the wider world about some of the things that we talk about. I'll start off with some news, and then after that, today I'm going to cover some of the notions of language that we don't really talk about very often, but which are very pertinent to the kinds of arguments and discussions that we have. So I'll get onto that in a moment. First of all, to give you an update, obviously the Media Festival is almost upon us, and has shown that we once again can create major events around the world. For anybody who's new to this, the Zeitgeist Movement is running and creating and supporting Zeitgeist media festivals around the world that feature artists with particular social bents, particular social interests, in order to spread the word and in order to get people to think about sustainable values, if you like, through the methods of modern media, which are, of course, abundant and very interesting. And the main LA event has some live painting performances, I think it is, and a few other very interesting characters. There's Mark Twain will be appearing, which I think is fascinating. But yeah, that's upon us, so make sure you get your tickets if you are attending one of them in your area. There are quite a few on zeitgeistmediafestival.org. They're all listed there. If you just Google Zeitgeist Media Festival, you'll find that as well as some of the associated websites for it. An update on another festival. The Leeds and Reading Festival is very close now. It's actually next weekend. And we have confirmation that Enter Shikari, who are one of the major bands playing there, they appear as sort of above the fold, if you like, have confirmed to us that they will mention us on stage and that they have banners and that they will have tables with giveaways and all the rest of it, in as much as they can actually do that within the setting of a festival that isn't, of course, theirs, if you like. So it's incredibly positive. For those of you who don't know Enter Shikari, it's worth Googling them. This band plays something like 260 shows a year, and they're in the middle of a huge European tour, and they've actually directly messaged the movement via the meetup, via the forum, and individually, to say that they want to have Zeitgeist people attend every one of the shows that they possibly can, to give them an opportunity to spread what we talk about to the audience of Enter Shikari. Now, Shikari has always been socially minded before the movement even existed, and they've always talked about this stuff. So it's extremely valuable that in this European tour that as many of you go to these shows as possible. And it'd be worth checking them out live for a start, but because it's very important to go to places that are relevant. And what could be more relevant than a band who is socially minded, socially conscious, wears its social dispositions on its sleeve and uses it in its writing, to get access to their audience and have that discussion. You'll find that there's a lot of people there who are already probably interested, or if they're not, they might be interested if they come across it. That is the goal. So that's a very positive development there. It just shows once again that after a few short years that we're actually getting into places that would be very difficult for any movement that has the sort of tenets that ours does, which is very alien, very foreign, very unconventional, and of course not really compatible with the profit system. We nevertheless are being able to get this word out to the wider world. So that's very positive there. Another update is that I recently attended the Zeitgeist Town Hall meeting in Amsterdam. They organized a town hall in something like 2 weeks from beginning to end. I went there and did 2 short presentations, about 15 minutes each. And unfortunately, there were some technical issues with the first presentation. I couldn't quite get it on the screen correctly, but nevertheless, overall, the mood there was very, very interesting. Holland is filled with critical minds, and I'm pretty sure that most of the hegemonic first world dispositions would be appalled at how free-thinking these people are. So it was very interesting to meet some of the Amsterdam members and to see what they've been doing, to see where their interests lie and sort of what they're doing. It's extremely interesting as well that they even managed to create a base within Amsterdam. They have a place that they share with other organizations, so that they actually sort of have an office. They just book the time there. So I thought that was very, very interesting as well. And again, something that I would not readily see, I think, in any other city. I can't imagine a sort of a free, decent house in the middle of Amsterdam. I can't imagine that equivalent in London, for example. But that was very interesting. We had about 100 people there. And a lot of the topics, of course, a lot of the questions that came up were, well, what do we do? We know the system is screwing us. What do we do now? And, of course, we had to come back to the point that, well, we need critical mass. You can't really change a system that relies on having you as a servant to it so that you can survive, unless everybody wants to change it. And everybody understands what the problem is. And this is still not understood, really. And I'll come to that a little bit more when I talk about language in a moment. A quick 2 recommendations I have for podcasts. One is Zeitgeist related, the other one is sort of related, but not from us. The first one is that I noticed recently that the Southwest Florida chapter have a blog talk radio show as well now, and it appears therefore on iTunes as well. I would recommend to download those for no other reason other than the fact that they've managed somehow to block the adverts out, which is wonderful, of course. So worth listening to those guys. It's worth always finding out about what we're doing worldwide, and it's more free audio. I don't know about you, but I walk around with my iPod plugged in continuously, just listening to podcasts. They're a wonderful source of information. And on that topic, there's another radio show that I come across recently that might be very interesting for members. It's called the Point of Inquiry radio show, or Point of Inquiry. It's on iTunes. Again, it's free. And this features quite a lot of people that we're interested in. For those who are interested in the arguments of Zeitgeist 1 regarding religion, Charia S has been on it before, DM Murdoch. She's been on it quite recently, actually. And we have other people there, Dawkins. Daniel Pink appears on there, as far as I know, and there's huge amounts. There's 40 or 50 podcasts, all an hour or so, sometimes longer, which are full-blown, interesting discussions on various points, and not always points I agree with either. They had Michael Behe on, who is the sort of scientist who got involved with intelligent design. I don't agree with his argument, but I really appreciate being able to listen to him and hear that actually he's had the same kinds of problems within the scientific community to accept a new idea, whether it's valid or not, without being sort of pilloried and blackballed, which is really not what science is about. It's about actually getting involved with the information and saying, sorry, this isn't correct, or yes, this is correct. But it's very interesting nevertheless. And, if you only expose yourselves to things you agree with, you're never going to develop anyway. So I find it very valid that even though the broad aim of that podcast, Point of Inquiry, is secular humanism, they do give enough time to those that don't agree with them, and I find that very useful. So that's the updates for now. Worth covering some of the basic tenets of our movement before we carry on. For new listeners, or just simply to contextualize everything I'm about to say, the Zeitgeist Movement is a grassroots social organization. We aren't political, and we are here to attempt to spread the word about an alternative system made possible by the tools that we now have at our disposal in modern life. Very simply, here are some of the fundamentals of that. The first thing we really talk about a lot is automation. We are now able to automate a huge deal of the elements of society that used to have to be run by people. We talk about this a lot because it's extremely important to understand. We can now produce more and quicker and in higher volume and better than human labor through robotics and machines. I was recently showing my daughter a video of how a car is made because she asked where they came from. And there's a wonderful clip on YouTube that's about 9 minutes long that shows the whole process. And what is notable in its absence is human beings. There are very, very few interactions to build a car these days. It's all done by robotics and automation. This is being extended everywhere. You can buy cinema tickets from machines now rather than people, which means queuing goes down. It is better. It does the same thing. You can buy your groceries from a robot by doing self-checkout. That's been around for a very long time, but it's really starting to take hold now. And there's reasons for that I will get to a little bit later. The bottom line is this. Since we can produce better, higher quality products with more accuracy and less waste and error than human labor, we propose that automation be placed into as many pockets of society as possible. Now, there's a counter side to that, which of course is employment. Up to now, employment has been literally the employment of labor to create run the systems that we have, no matter what they are, whether it's the postal system or whether it's factory labor or whatever. And this has been the fundamentals for a sort of a basic capitalist existence, has been this is how you earn your money, and this is of course how you pay your debt to society, if you like, on another level, because you're creating goods for other people. And from that you then earn the money from which you then buy the goods from that same society. Now, it used to work. I have a presentation that I'm uploading shortly that shows the various levels of capitalism that have existed since the 1700s all the way up to now, and they were all logical byproducts of what was needed at the time. The thing is now that with the advent of serious automation, we are coming to a point where we can't use employment as a basis for the economy anymore. And if you look at certain statistics, it looks like we're about at a fifth of unemployment in the US. The UK would have similar numbers. Of course, they're not reported as that. They're reported a lot lower. So we seek the removal of employment, basically, as the necessary prerequisite for gaining from a society, because it's no longer actually tangible. It's no longer able to be supported by the fact that we are now automating anyway. Now, why are we automating? Because it would seem that, if we wanted to keep the system going the way it was, we probably wouldn't, right? We would just, make sure that employment was the basis, and so anything that took away from that would be selected against, wouldn't it? It would be not put into place. Well, the thing is, money. We still run on a monetary economy, obviously. Many people know that. And the logic of the monetary system at the moment is to maximize profit. And you maximize profit by not paying people. And the easiest way to do that is to automate. You automate because it's cheaper, because you don't have to employ human beings anymore. And of course, one of the reasons why automation has taken such a hold in the last 12 months in the UK, at least in the supermarket and grocery store and the sort of on the high street, is because of the financial crash, really, one of the big pushes for it. As the financial system gets ever more embroiled in debt and more debt and more debt, as we borrow more and more and more non-existent money manufactured out of a need to repay it, in other words, debt, you therefore have the issue as an employer to lower your costs of production or delivery so that you can still make a lot of profit without raising your prices because no one has any money to pay extra. Best way to do that is to automate. It's efficient. The labor required to keep the automation going is a fraction of the original labor that you're actually replacing. And so that's why we see such an increase in automation. Now, money has problems for a couple of other reasons. For a start, like I mentioned just now, it is a generator of debt. Recently, the US had to basically capitulate and agree to borrow even more and to change the terms of its borrowing because they'd hit their so-called debt ceiling, which was the point at which the interest is unpayable on the debt to begin with. Your whole GDP is less as a country than the one interest payment on the debt you have amassed in running that society. So this is a problem that needs to be overcome as well. And it can't really be overcome by a simple reformation of the monetary system into something that is, for example, purely specie payments, purely payments backed by 100% reserves. You could do that. You could say that the money that's in circulation is backed in kind by gold or whatever you like. You could do that. But it's not going to solve the problem that the Zeitgeist Movement sees. The problems that we see in society are not just the fact that employment is disappearing, that automation is beneficial, or that debt is an issue. It's that by using money, we promote the idea of making money off problems rather than by solving those problems. Problems don't get solved as long as money can be made off them. And if money can't be made off them, those problems are not solved at all, something I'll address later on in this broadcast when I talk about gun ownership in Michigan. So this is an issue that we see as well. And this is not going to be circumvented unless you remove the need that has been placed in there. We can move to a society where we employ automation to create an abundance of quality, high product value goods that actually have a tangible benefit to people. They're not just meaningless items that we sell. It's not just another tablet PC or something like this. You're actually creating items that really are going to last, that can be upgraded, that can be disposed of correctly. Whereas at the moment in the profit system, where you are a manufacturer, you are going to have to cut corners. You're going to have to sell it for as high as price as possible, pay your workers the lowest possible price. Have a look at Foxconn. Foxconn are the people who are essentially putting together the iPods and iPhones for the US, and the suicide rate in that factory is depressing. This is a byproduct of the fact that we still operate on a need basis in society, where we really don't have to anymore. There is enough to go around. There's so much to go around that your life would be so much better than it is now. It would be unimaginably better if we really deliberately placed technology at the center of our society and said, right, now we're going to create systems that work as well as possible and not just purely as profitably as possible. In fact, economic efficiency is exactly the opposite of real efficiency, in that, well, you've managed to put in this much money and you've got this much out, which is even more. That's economically efficient. Of course, it's incredibly inefficient because in real life, of course, you're operating a system where you cut as many corners as possible. You're paying people the least amount. You're using either inferior quality goods to create those goods, so inferior metals, or you're just deliberately overpricing and making people pay even more from their hard-earned money. So this is another issue that we see, and it's an issue that's not going to be circumvented by simple monetary reform, but in fact by the surpassing of the monetary system itself to a post-scarcity economy, where we no longer have the sort of limitations of this sort of pseudo-Darwinistic competitive mentality. And speaking of competition, that is sort of the next portion that we talk about. A lot of people see competition as a positive thing. They see it as something that will somehow get to the right answer. That competing ideas, competing companies, the best one will win out. And this is pseudo-Darwinistic on a couple of levels. First off, people think that the best societies, the ones that are doing well at the moment in the game, are the best societies. And that's sort of a little bit of a fallacy, because the reason why different societies look the way they do is not because one of their systems is working better or worse necessarily than others. It can be that one society has affected another society positively or negatively. Consider this. The agricultural revolution that the Western civilization sort of got hold of spread outwards, of course. The technologies that we had were exported to countries around us. The same with weapons manufacture, the same with technologies to keep people alive, so healthcare, immunization, all the rest of it. And these all spread out in waves from Western civilization outwards towards the East. Now, that wasn't the only direction, of course, but when we're talking about this particularly the Western civilization effect on society. So when Russia and Asia received these technologies, they actually received them in a different order to how Britain received them, for example. We had our agricultural revolution. We moved to the cities because we had industrial society growing after the agricultural revolution. So therefore, we, of course, had healthcare systems that could make sure that lots of human beings could live in a city without all dying. And this, of course, all succeeded each other in a sort of supportive way. The problem here is that the healthcare revolutions and transport revolutions that hit the sort of Near and Far East preceded the agricultural revolution, which meant that we now had more people alive and not enough food to fill that need. So you end up with famine. Now, famine isn't the fault of the Russian system, so to speak, or the Asiatic system. It is the incorrect receival or the negative receipt of technologies in a different order that has sometimes created these problems. Now, of course, with famine, that's not true of all famine around the world, but it gives you an example of where the comparing of different social systems is invalid based on the fact you haven't factored in how one system affected another system, quite regardless of its monetary system. So when we say, oh well, capitalism is the best system ever, because that's the one that's got the most, traction, or that's the one that's got the most money, you're actually not looking at, or one is not actually looking at the historical seat of capitalism, or of any system which is around now. And we're not also looking at the way that countries affect each other, sometimes by accident. So that's one of the things as well. Now, the other problem with competition is that, of course, it's incredibly wasteful. If you have, and we see this definitely with the tablet PC market, for example. If you have 10, 15, 20 companies all producing tablets, you are using glass and plastic and metal that is either hard to replace or doesn't need to be used to this degree. The number of wasted minerals from this competitive mentality is itself already a problem, to say nothing of the fact that it also has an impact upon the whole not being able to solve problems correctly. If you were to just unify everybody around the world technologically, which is the ultimate goal of what we look for in the system that we call a resource-based economy, then you would have an incredible speedy progress. But so far, competition actually hinders progress. It's got to the point now where we're patenting individual genes so that people can't create cures for diabetes, for example, because the genes that would be involved in that cure are owned by somebody else. We've seen this as well in the last couple of weeks in the patent wars that Apple is fighting and Google is fighting. Google bought Motorola recently for no other reason than they have 1,700 patents. Of course, yes, it gets them into hardware and all the rest of it. But what we're seeing here is a competitive mentality at its worst. We're seeing the ownership of ideas to the detriment of the ability to develop those ideas outside of that company, because that company has to rely on those for an income. It has to live. And in living, it's detrimental to our actual progress and survival. Now, it's of course very minor when we're talking about computing, but when we're talking about genes, when we're talking about medicine, when we're talking about all of the things that actually have a social benefit, that actually have an effect on life, when these things are hindered, everything must be done to try and stop that hindrance, to end this competitive hoarding ownership mentality that has sort of infected life that we have today. And that's really the fundamentals of what we talk about. We seek the removal of the system that we have, replacing it, and it'll have to be a gradual replacement, with abundant systems, free of toxicity, supporting life deliberately and ascribing a value to that life, because at the moment we don't do that. We think probably intuitively that our system does this now, but it doesn't. And you can see that it is gradually becoming very, very obvious. My home country is, just about not on fire anymore, having had major riots. And those riots, of course, have been triggered by this real undercurrent of suffering and this inoperation, if you like, of society in Britain. And it's very telling, of course, that it's not described as such, of course, in the media. So there we go. So that's a basic roundup of what our tenets are. I wanted now to speak a lot about euphemisms and language. So you heard Christopher Hitchens in the introduction talking about Orwell. Orwell is one of the most famous critics, if you like, or almost like a social scientist when it came to language. He very much understood that the sort of point of power, the point of real control is in the language. We talk very often about how the economic system doesn't lend itself to social mobility for the logic of profit and sort of free enterprise, if you like, means being able to have a sort of a captive audience to control over a certain section of society that's necessary so that you can profit off it. We talk about that all the time, but one thing I find much more powerful is that in the discussion of these ideas that we have and any ideas about culture, and really that's the most broad it can get is culture, we are inhibited by our language on multiple levels. I first became aware of this as an actual problem a few years ago, probably about a decade ago, when I was having a discussion with a girlfriend of mine, and we were talking about German last names like Müller and similar ones. And I said, well, it's very interesting because, of course, Müller means miller in English. So it gives you an insight into what that person's family might have done at some point, or where the lineage of that name, that last name, comes from. And I got the answer back that no, it was just a name. And I found that astonishing because it really is a noun as well. Just like Miller, just like Smith, just like Thatcher are all actual jobs. And I then realized that a lot of people don't tie the fact that there is a small mouth noise that you create, a noise, a word, but that word can actually be either divorced from its meaning or that it actually has a meaning to begin with. So let's have a look at this. So what is language? It's a collection of two items, really. On one side are signifiers. These are noises, communications that we use to identify an object or a thing or a belief if you're going to a second level. These are the indicative noises that we make. And the second portion of that is, of course, the signified, which is the actual thing being discussed. And these are two separate items, and these aren't really ever understood to be two separate items by sort of an average discussion, and they can get confused and lost and subverted. So what's very interesting is that you can actually tell the value of certain ideas in culture by the collections and numbers of words that describe or are used by the language to focus on them. I'll give you two comedic examples. The first one's quite famous but is misquoted quite a lot. The Eskimos, the Inuit tribes of far North America, have around 15 words for snow. Hence, you can tell it's important to them. This is something which obviously appears very often in the environment, and so hence there is a certain subtlety in the levels of description that the Eskimos have employed. Now you hear them saying that there's hundreds of them for snow, but I've come across 15 actual words on the page which appeared to denote very subtle differences between ice and snow and all the rest of it. So, there's one metric you can use, is how often the rhetoric, how often the particular words come up in a culture, identify some of the concentration, the direction of concentration, and what the focus of that culture might be. More amusingly, modern British English features 141 euphemisms and descriptors for the act of being drunk, according to a 2002 story. So we probably have way more since then. And who could argue that that's not an absolute staple of the culture? This is not unique to British English or English at all. It's not unique to any culture, actually. I think in the two languages I speak, I know that there are a lot of words for being intoxicated. And some of them, of course, are deliberately humorous, but you could really create one on the fly by just finding a noun and putting ed on the end and just say, wow, man, I'm totally bottled today. Man, I'm so tabled you wouldn't believe it. So, it gives you another idea. And it's interesting also, of course, that they are euphemisms deliberately that describe the act of being drunk. Being drunk is not something we want to directly talk about. So we call it, soused and kippered and sozzled and all these nice-sounding words that are actually denoting something which is essentially drug intoxication. The great power of state language and accepted discourse is to hijack this connection between the signifier, the actual word, and the signified, the actual thing or the idea or whatever is being denoted. And obviously the most powerful version of this is euphemism. Euphemism comes from the Greek, means, euphemi means I speak nicely. So it gives you an idea that it is essentially, as Hitchens denotes in the beginning of this podcast, a nice way of saying something nasty. It is deliberately to use a signifier that colors your idea of the signified. Yeah, so it is imposing on you a certain judgment about the thing being spoken about. And Hitchens even mentions a good version, collateral damage. Collateral damage is, of course, now so overused that it's become part of the culture. It's like he says, it's the revenge of history that these euphemisms become coined deliberately, and so that they then become sort of useless or become such a given that it doesn't have the effect that the original euphemism was intended for. And something like collateral damage is so deliberate that it's not even an accidental euphemism where you've maybe misdescribed something. It's a deliberate euphemism in this case, where there has actually been a conscious decision to use this signifier, this collateral damage, to hide what Hitchens denotes as civilian casualties. Now, it's actually very interesting that Hitchens uses another euphemism to define this euphemism, isn't it? Civilian is a nice long word, doesn't make us think of women and children, does it? Casualties has the word casual in there. This isn't the word deaths or murder or destruction of human beings. But nevertheless, he doesn't mean to, I don't think. But it just shows you how ingrained our language is, that we can't get through to the items that we want to discuss without stumbling across a lot of fuzzy wording. There's some others, breaking the china is the accidental destruction of surrounding structures within a country if you're bombing it. Extraordinary rendition. I find this the best because it's so divorced. It doesn't even have the correct sort of verb. Breaking the china gives you an idea of destruction. Collateral damage, the word damage is in there. Civilian casualties, at least we understand that casualties is a negative. But extraordinary rendition are two positive words that have nothing to do with the actual act it describes. If you've never come across this, extraordinary rendition is the act of hijacking, essentially, prisoners of war or people you've captured and taking them to countries that would allow torture and torturing them in secret in faraway, unregulated places. And this has happened a lot in the last couple of years. Now, there's nothing about rendition or extraordinary that actually describes that situation whatsoever. Instead, it just sounds incredibly positive, doesn't it? Extraordinary rendition would be like going to the Royal Shakespeare Company and seeing someone do Hamlet in an astonishing new way. It would be an extraordinary rendition of Hamlet, of the Mad Prince, right? Friendly fire, there's another good one as well. I mean, in that case, what's happening is that we're describing the accidental murder of one troop by another troop on his team, on his side. Or her side, and it's called friendly fire. Does it make it any better that you're getting shot in the face if the gun belongs to your country? It doesn't, does it? But of course we hide it behind those things. Two that are very famous in Britain for various reasons. Both come from George Orwell. Obviously, you're already thinking of them: Big Brother and Room 101. Big Brother, of course, is I'd never realized is actually a euphemism because it's become so ingrained as this negative state power, this ever-watchful gaze. You forget the idea that it's actually appealing to your euphemistic logic. Big Brother. Big means protective, of course. If you're older sibling, you're meant to be protective. Certainly you're meant to be somebody with slightly more power, if you like. And of course, brother, is one of you. He's allied to you. And of course, it's used in exactly the opposite way in Orwell's book and in any of the films. There have actually been some very good films of 1984. Room 101, of course, is what we denote as the worst place you'd ever want to go. Of course, it's the torture chamber in 1984. Interestingly enough, Room 101 is actually a real room. It comes from the BBC. BBC's broadcasting house has a Room 101, and for some reason Orwell didn't like it. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was the approval department. So it's interesting to see where the idea came from. But of course, these are used as labels to disguise their natures. And funnily enough, of course, both of those are now very famous television programs in the UK. Big Brother, of course, is famous worldwide. Room 101 is a sort of a comedy show where people get to, drop things they hate into Room 101. They get to eulogize about something they really have a hatred against. And one wonderful moment of it was Spike Milligan in the late 90s, I think it was, putting all of Portsmouth into Room 101, which is nice because I used to live there. So you can see how euphemism actually makes itself apparent gradually, but in the first instance, for many years, it can go undetected. And I still think it's actually quite undetected in many other portions of our culture. It is interesting that the collective existence around a subject of war reveals how this language has been used to disguise that particular version of events, that nature. To disguise war is necessary because it's still understood very, very far back in our psyche that we don't like war, that war is a negative thing. And so that's why we see so many of those words around the notion of crossfire and war and battles, same way that we see the concentration around snow for the Inuit and drunkenness for the English language. There are plenty in civilian life, of course. Cash in your chips, sleeping with the fishes, cement shoes, in reduced circumstances. These are all sort of, glossovers for death and poverty. Of course, sleeping with the fishes advertises itself as grammatically incorrect, obviously, as well, because, of course, we're mimicking the mafia who used to describe that. So there are many of these things, and one of the great lessons in 1984 is the chiseling out of a language which actually makes critical thought impossible to be delivered by that language. This is called Newspeak, and even though we're speaking about a fictional book here, obviously Orwell was denoting this from normal life. He was actually getting it from somewhere. And even though Newspeak is very cartoonish for us, I mean, the book has even got an appendix where it sort of lists some of the euphemisms and some of the new ways of speaking. It really does show you how language can be contorted so that you can't even object to a system on rational grounds, because the method of delivery of that objection, the language, is also controlled by the controlling sort of value set, also controlled by the culture. It's part of the culture. And so if you model that so that it can't easily be used to describe a problem with this system, then of course you have the strength that arms would not get you. And one of the great moments, of course, in the Newspeak dictionary that sits in the appendix of 1984, is it actually demonstrates that it's impossible to say a certain phrase in Newspeak. It can't be rendered in the way that you speak now. And that is, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. It becomes an unspeakable, literally unspeakable element. It is impossible to think about it. And you hear this kind of rationalization all the time, of course. There are certain cultures that don't have words for shame. You know, they don't have the same connotations of bravery, for example. In fact, to show how far down this goes, I found an example recently that's a very telling example of how a language can be a reflection of the culture. I found it in James Gilligan's book, Preventing Violence, where it speaks about a non-violent society called the Buid, which were a highland group in Mindoro, the Philippines, who reject any form of violence, aggression, or even competition. And they actually disapprove of boastfulness, quarreling, attempts to dominate others, which they see as sort of leading to violence and murder. In the Anthropology of War, there's actually a direct quotation of the Buid, in which it says, "The Buid, by contrast, have no word for courage, in the sense of a positively valued aggressive attitude in the face of physical danger. There are many words for fear, and fear of and flight from danger, neither of which is seen as being reprehensible. Indeed, they are the only rational responses to danger." So it's very interesting to see how, again, we see this pattern of how a culture behaves based on how it communicates. And that's, of course, very, very powerful. Now, there's two other broad developments that I want to cover with euphemism, and these are sort of outside the deliberate linkage of words to meaning and more towards social operation. So, think about this. Social and economic euphemism. There's actually a mechanism that we haven't really spotted in society that euphemizes the value of some systems against being judged correctly. Now, what do I actually mean by that? The underrating or excision of meaning from a social system so as to render it indefensible against subjugation to the needs of the system. In other words, if I was having a conversation recently with someone, because I was in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I'd met a gun seller. I'd actually gone and met a guy who actually sells guns to people. And, I'd come away from the conversation baffled and impressed, actually, because he was, of course, against violence, but he really knew his stuff when it came to guns, and he was a big hunter and all the rest of it. But I remain, I remain not a fan of guns at all. And I came back and I had a discussion with someone, and I sort of said, well, why is it that we can have lots and lots of guns in Switzerland? I think they have the most guns per capita in the world. There's Canada, Britain has guns, Germany has a huge amount of guns, and they use it for hunting. Why is it then that in America there are so many more deaths from handguns and from associated rifle usage and all the rest of it? And the answer came back, and it was a fairly decent one, that, well, there's no safety net. So the stress is higher. So as if you get made unemployed, you have really one direction to go, and that is towards violence to protect yourself, and maybe just the stress of your position makes you into a homicidal maniac. And that's true, isn't it? And then I said, well, why is it that they don't just put in some social systems? Because surely it would be worth it. given the fact that thousands and thousands of people are dying every year from just the handgun usage? And the answer came back, well, it costs more to fix than it does to support the system in its a bad form now. Now, if you think about that, it is a euphemism, because what we're euphemizing is that human life, whether it's 1 or whether it's 23,000 a year, doesn't have any value in the economic sense. There's no money in just having people not die and just having them live normally. That doesn't construct in our heads something of value. There is no value assigned to it in the first place. And so what you get is the inability to defend social systems that might act freely, such as free healthcare, which of course is not free, it's taxed, but it's built in. It's given a priori, so you'd have to earn it first in that sense, in the direct sense of buying as you need it. And it ascribes no value to those, and it ascribes only cost. It only costs money to have things that are free for people. That it's a detriment to the state. Now, why is that? It's a detriment because it runs against the profit motive, doesn't it? Any system that seeks to be generous, that seeks to be abundant, that seeks to be supportive, is exactly the opposite of what the profit system wants, and what the profit system can endure. And so, therefore, we euphemize the way that we think about these items before we even ascribe them any name as being of little value, things that we can not have, that we can just ignore, that we can get rid of, that we can sell off, that we can privatize. These are non-value systems. And that is a euphemism, because it's actually hiding the logic behind the attitude. There's another example. Profit itself is actually a euphemism, the word profit. Mike Ruppert said it very, very well. You have to create problems to create profit, or you just have to have problems to create profit. That's true because we need to buy a temporary, hopefully, solution so that the profit mechanism can be kept going. Polluted water means we can manufacture lots and lots of bottled water. It's a temporary resolution because the water is still polluted, isn't it? We now just need cleaning systems and the use of intense amounts of plastic, and to have it cost more than petrol in certain areas of the world. And, so we say, but it's okay because we can make a profit from this. Now, let's have a look at how profit works. There is clearly no value in overcoming something completely. We have eradicated precisely 2 diseases officially since we began jabs and immunization. One of them is smallpox. The other one that we officially cured literally last week was rinderpest, which had been on the boards for a while, but it was finally confirmed by the World Health Organization. This alone gives you an idea, very much like the collections of words do in language. It gives you an idea of where our priorities are, if we've managed to just get rid of only 2. Now, I'm not trying to underestimate the difficulty in eradicating something that's in our environment, but it can be done, and it has been done. But it's very unfortunate that that's obviously not where most of the drugs in the world are acting upon. Compared to immunization, we have a huge amount of temporary drugs, if you like. And this is based on the fact that companies need to produce something so they can keep reselling it. And there's no point in curing cancer, curing AIDS, curing any of these things that have a vast dollar bill associated with them in the mechanism of society the way it runs now. So we have this word profit, which, if you really break it down, it euphemizes the negative effect by positing it as the meaning of gain. Profit is, of course, gain, isn't it? It's to earn, it's to come away with more than you had. Where such a profit is actually a loss to the people who must submit to the interaction that profits usually a smaller group or even one person sometimes. So we use this word as gain, but what we're saying with gain really is that, well, it's going to be a gain for the few in return for a problem for the many that they have to sort of endure. And the profit resides in you being able to be that gatekeeper between the problem that exists and of course the solution that you offer, the temporary solution rather, or the fix, if you like. And so we are actually operating on a system there where you'll hear people say, well, it's against profit, and profit is good. Just remember that profit itself is the kind of euphemism that we're talking about, one that subverts the argument. Another great one that people use all the time, they even use it on Project Censored, which I'm quite surprised about, is freedom and democracy. These are not even words that mean anything, but essentially any attack on a social system is somehow an attack on freedom and democracy. Now, democracy, the way it exists in the modern world at the moment, is the act of doing some small thing once every 4 years or once every 5 years. And that's it. You don't actually have an interaction with society, but it's euphemized as democracy in the sense that it's power for, kratos for the demos, right? It's power for the people. That's not a correct translation, but nevertheless. This governance by the people, for the people, by the people, of the people, is in fact not those things at all. I don't have to explain to anyone listening to this podcast probably that the real power of society is nowhere near the ballot box, and it does absolutely nothing. It's built in way above that. I think we all understand that now. But of course, democracy is used. So any attack on our system, whether it's a suggestion for an update, by the way, or whether it's just a broad criticism, is attacked by saying, this is against the profit system. There's one euphemism. This is against freedom, which is the freedom of large corporations to make more money and more money and more money, and not actually the freedom of individuals. That hasn't been ascribed a value in the first place. And democracy, which is really denoting the absolute circumscription of power, so that there is no way for the populace to get involved. And of course, it gets you to defend democracy. It gets you to defend the things that you've had to accept. It's very, very clever. There are strategic victories all the time. I think one of the greatest strategic victories was to have us fight to get the vote. In the countries that allow voting, it's often held up as a point against criticism, to say, well, at least you have the right to vote, and we fought for the right to vote, and people died for the right to vote. But what is the right to vote? The right to vote is still meaningless. And so not only is this a euphemism in that sense of democracy, but you actually end up where the euphemism itself is something that is demanded. You have to have the euphemism now, because we've actually had a hard time getting to this low level of power in society. And so it ends up being a sort of self-justifying struggle, because it was hard to get to simply this level of societal interaction. That's somehow enough of a sacrifice that we have to keep it forever, and that it was worth fighting for, and it wasn't perhaps something that has distracted us from the real problems, from the real interaction of society. So the next time you hear a politician speak, or any public figure speak, including myself, listen out for these euphemisms, either direct euphemisms that have sort of undermined the original meaning, or disguising and imposing a positive over a negative, or for logical euphemisms, social euphemisms, where the value of a system that is seen to be in contrast and in threat to an existing value doctrine is being hidden or being negated in favor of its own systems. They're very, very common. They're a little bit tricky to see, because we've not been, of course, taught to think like this, because the goal is to not have this debate even arise to begin with. So there we have it. The final euphemism I want to point out is that word leader that we keep hearing in the movement. This movement is a leaderless environment, in the sense that it is purely about the information and relaying the information to people on the outside and to each other and all the rest of it. It is a discussion, essentially, that is happening, a value war between the values of the present system and the values of human life and a society that's successful. And, of course, within that society that we've had at the moment, leaders are put in place, and leaders exist, and we denote these leaders. But, of course, what is a leader? A leader is essentially someone who's making your decisions for you. And I have not met anybody in the movement who would want that. And yet, for some reason, we still seem to cling on to this word, because it's the only way that we seem to be able to operate. When people in the movement talk about leadership, they're employing a rather negative euphemism themselves. The goal is very obvious. The goal is self-evident based on the application of science and technology to understand. We don't need a leader for that. And really, a leader is just a shorthand for not having to think for yourself or make decisions for yourself and just turn up and wave a flag. Well, I'm sorry, but it doesn't work that way. Not when you're dealing with information that understands that the true goal of a society is not to be led at all, but to be able to just survive and be able to live an abundant, healthy life without being told how to live it, informed by the knowledge of a single person or even a group of people isn't enough. It's not going to do the job in a society that's meant to be resource-based. We have to devolve our understanding to, rather delegate our understanding to intelligent machines and the logic of understanding our earthly environment and how to look after it and how best to live in tandem with it. So bear that in mind for the word leader. It's a euphemism for not thinking. And if anything, I've met absolutely nobody who doesn't do their own thinking in the movement, at least in person. So that's about where I'll wrap it up for now. And we will be back probably next week with another rotation. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you all soon.